This is the lakehead system. In red in the square is the Line 6B, where the accident happened on the Enbridge pipeline. A few days before the incident happened, 10 days to be exact, Enbridge was before Congress and having to testify because there were so many anomalies on this Line 6B, and they were not repairing them in a quick enough time period, so Congress was questioning whether this pipeline was actually safe. And they said that they can detect a leak almost instantaneously, and quickly go through the timeline. And some of you may have heard about this with the National Transportation Safety Board investigation reveal, where they found out the alarms had indicated an issue on July 25th around 5:56 p.m. Enbridge ignored those alarms, pumped a ton of oil into the system trying to override them. Sorry, I'm being very quick. Let me know if you have questions at the end, but the long story short is 17 hours after alarms indicated an issue, they were told by a local utility that a spill had happened into Talmadge Creek and the Kalamazoo River, which is all part of the Kalamazoo River watershed. This is a photo of the rupture. What was it, 6 feet in length? Around 6 feet in length. And it was the National Transportation Safety Board, which investigated the cause of the spill, said that the tape coating, which you can see here peeled off, had gone around a weld. And you can see the weld here. And that tape coating caused this effect called tenting, and it allowed for external environmental things like water, soil, to get into the space between the tape and the pipeline, which caused external corrosion. A bunch of cracks happened on the line over time, and actually 5 years before this disaster happened, Enbridge knew that those cracks were combining to be one and that there was an issue, but they continued to put it off and continued to not address the problem. And they've actually known that this tape coating causes external corrosion for a really long time. I think since the 80s it's been a known issue, but there's never been any federal action to require pipeline operators to correct the problem. Just going to go through some photos and quickly talk about what happened. The response, well, let me get to this first, sorry. So this is the breakdown on how this impacted Enbridge's bottom line. And this is important in the fact that cost-benefit analysis shows that even with this disaster, which was, they spent the most amount of money cleaning up, it's now $8 million, it's not $800 million, it's not $700 million. That's the cost of the spill cleanup, and it's growing. Compared to their bottom line for 2011, and then when you look at the fines and penalties that they have received thus far from the Pipeline Hazardous Safety Materials Administration, it's this very small dot. So this is just a comparison to see, what kind of impact this disaster, which was the largest inland oil spill in history and the most expensive. And it still had very little impact on the bottom line for them. And so that gets to the point that it might be cheaper for them to just continue operating than to address certain areas of the pipeline. So the Kalamazoo River was at high water mark. I think I've heard that it was 100-year flood. So the oil, as you can see, this is Talmadge Creek, really saturated overbank areas, wetlands. The spill actually occurred in the wetland in Marshall area. It saturated that wetland 5-acre area so heavily that it flew into Talmadge Creek. And Talmadge Creek is the tributary to Kalamazoo River, and then it went 40 miles down the Kalamazoo River. So it saturated 2 miles of Talmadge Creek and then 40 miles in total of the Kalamazoo River system. So you can, it was a very thick, substantial event. Enbridge estimates around 840,000 gallons spilled, but the EPA has reported that they've cleaned up 1.1 million gallons of oil, and then they've also admitted that there's a lot of submerged oil, around 300 acres of submerged oil in the river system, because the product that spilled is called diluted bitumen. It's a heavier product once weathering starts to occur, and so it's heavier than water, sinks in water systems, and so now we're dealing with basically oil at the bottom of the lake. It's not a heavy, heavy amount because they've gone in and they've dredged certain areas, they've aerated certain areas during the cleanup, and so around 300 acres of submerged oil remains. And this is, again, a unique characteristic to diluted bitumen spills, which is the main product that runs through a lot of the pipelines in the Great Lakes, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. Just some aerial shots of the river. This is a breakout of the Unified Command after the spill occurred, and the red is all the local groups or the agencies that were involved in the response, and it's overwhelming. So it just gets to the point, and some of I missed a couple on there as well, but it gets to the point that when a disaster occurs, it's not the federal agencies coming in and doing all the work to clean it up. It's a lot of local response, and local municipalities and groups are not prepared for this kind of thing. And so that's part of the conversation today, is to get it on your radar, and hopefully we can work within our local networks to make sure that we have the systems in place to deal with these kind of disasters. It's just a view of how far it actually, this is an incorrect map as well. It's in Dimaro Lake, and they've actually found oil just past Dimaro Lake, and so it has traveled a little bit, and that's a characteristic, again, of the submerged oil and the heavy bitumen, is that it continues to travel underneath the surface of the water, and unless you put in, these, they call them boom capturing, and they're like cages, and they have these pom-poms underneath the water that the water sifts through them and the oil is collected in the pom-poms. Unless you put those all along the area in Talmadge Creek, or I'm sorry, Morrow Lake, there's no way to really capture it other than dredging, aerating, which is very destructive to the environment. Just about 2 months after the incident occurred, Enbridge was allowed to restart their line based off of a corrective action order. And this corrective action order included them replacing pieces of the line, including the international border crossing under the St. Clair River, because there was a known dent in that pipeline. So Candace Miller, the U.S. Congresswoman, advocated heavily to have that U.S. Border crossing, that pipeline replaced. And so they've done a number of things to the pipeline since, and they've actually put forward projects, which we'll get into, to replace this entire pipeline network. And they're also expanding the Lakehead pipeline network, and I'll show some photos of that. Emergency response and initial response was horrible. We can have side conversations about this issue, but in short, they just did not have the proper equipment. These guys are obviously not in proper hazmat suits, and they don't have respiratory systems on, and the initial response was devastating, and something that all of us need to learn from, especially considering the amount of pipelines and the expansion happening within the Great Lakes. Wildlife impacts were very heavy, especially for reptiles, turtles in particular, and birds. This gets back to the technology that these companies use, and it's very old technology, very frustrating. This is a plastic owl on a stick, and that's how they're trying to keep wildlife out of this oil-saturated wetland. I have pictures of wolverines, plastic wolverines on shorelines, and that's how they're trying to keep deer and wildlife out of the river. And they did use other methods, like they called cannons, and they shot off and tried to scare wildlife away. But it was a very poor response, and something that we can definitely learn from. Our office did actually get to go on a tour quickly to capture wildlife, and this is all part of that. So I'm going to quickly go through. Oh, this is a year later. So submerged oil continues to come up in certain areas and continues to become exposed, especially as the river system, we're in a drought stage in many areas of that part of the state. This is dredging, shows you how intensive it is. So this is the Lakehead system, the red off to the side, And that system, Enbridge is planning to expand because they want to pump more product to our part of the world. And we'll get into that a little bit more into our presentation, especially with Jeff, and then I'll wrap it up in this after everyone speaks with how that's going. I think I'll stop there and come back to all this. Jeff, if you want to talk about. So Jeff Alexander is going to go next, and he'll talk about an upcoming report that the National Wildlife Federation is releasing.
Well, thank you, Beth, and thank you everyone for coming to our session. If there's any silver lining from the Kalamazoo River oil spill, it's that it was a huge wake-up call for people in the region. I, for one, had no idea that we had these kinds of pipelines flowing across the Great Lakes and in our neighborhoods. So after the Kalamazoo oil spill, the Au River watershed group in northern Michigan asked me to write a report just sort of looking at the oil and gas infrastructure in their watershed. And to their great surprise and my surprise, there was a pipeline that went right under the Au River, which is one of the finest trout streams in North America. And it's the same pipeline that crosses the Straits of Mackinac. So I'm just curious, by a show of hands, how many of you have driven across the Mackinac Bridge? Okay, so you all know that it's just an incredibly beautiful area. Again, this is Enbridge Energy's pipeline network. The red pipes are the Lakehead system that we're sort of focusing on today. Since 2002, they've had 84 spills just on the Lakehead system. And I'm just going to go through a few of these spills. This one in 1990 was 900 yards away from Lake Michigan. It was cleaned up quickly, but the underwater plume did reach the lake. The state of Michigan decided that a cleanup wasn't necessary. 1999, this is another large spill just west of a small town in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and it was discovered by a motorist driving down the highway. Smelled a strong petroleum odor, called the fire department. This pipeline carries crude oil and natural gas liquids, and this spill happened in a wetland in a depressed sort of valley area, and this gas cloud started to accumulate. So before anyone could do anything, once Enbridge was notified, they went out and set it on fire because they had to evacuate the neighborhood. They had to evacuate a nursing home, and the fire burned for 36 hours. Another big spill in 2002 in Minnesota. Bay County, Michigan, that's near Sarnia, Ontario, where the pipeline crosses the St. Clair River. Wisconsin, the spill in Minnesota, this one killed 2 workers. Enbridge, in the case where the workers were killed, Enbridge was cited for improper safety procedures and was fined pretty substantially. These are all Enbridge spills. And these are just a few of the 82 or 84 spills.
How big or how many gallons do they consider to be a big spill? Because, I mean, 226,252, that's a lot of oil.
If we could wait. Sorry, that's okay. It's a wonderful question, and please bring it up
Yeah.
in a little bit because, yeah,
That's a very good question, and yeah, we definitely want to address that. So these are just a couple of other spills. You know, the Kalamazoo River spill happened. It sort of opened our eyes, and things really didn't change. The spills continued. There was a spill a couple of months after the Kalamazoo spill in Chicago. There was a spill this year in Wisconsin. So, you know, this pattern has just continued. So this pipeline that crosses the Straits of Mackinac carries 20 million gallons a day of crude oil and natural gas liquids. Enbridge wants to expand it by 50,000 barrels daily, which is another 2 million gallons of oil and natural gas liquids. This diagram on the left is a cross-section of the straits. And you need to think of the Straits of Mackinac as not so much a lake as a river channel. And so the pipeline, where it crosses, is sort of at the top of those downward pointing arrows in the channel there. So most of the pipeline is lying across open water, unsupported. Enbridge, on 2 occasions, has put in anchors to anchor it to the bottom of the lake. But the majority of the pipeline is sitting in open water, unsupported. So this pipeline was installed in 1953. That was the year Dwight Eisenhower took office. It was before McDonald's opened. So it's been there a long time. It's never been replaced. And it has a pretty spotty track record. So this is just a map of the straits. This map or diagram on the left shows the actual location of the pipeline. It's actually split into 2 pipes, and that's sort of a double-edged sword. The theory being that if you have 2 pipes, if one of them breaks, you only have half the volume of oil spilling. The flip side is it doubles the risk of a spill by having 2 pipes. And this is just a photo I took this past summer, just to give you an idea of how close this pipeline is to the bridge. If you're driving over the bridge and you look to the west, you're looking at where the pipeline is located, but you can't see it. You can't see the pumping station on either side of the straits from the bridge. It's all, if you go down the side roads near the lakeshore, you can see all this stuff, but it's not easy to find. So looks are deceiving. The straits, when you drive over the bridge, unless it's a really windy day, the water looks pretty calm. It's not moving very quickly, but the currents in the Straits of Mackinac are incredibly swift. There have been a couple of studies of the speed of currents in the straits. There are more studies going on now, but they found that the currents can reach up to 2 miles per hour. And what happens is, water is moving back and forth between Lake Michigan and Lake Huron, and if it's a windy day, these lakes act like giant bathtubs, and the water literally just sloshes back and forth. And these currents can get so strong that, it can be 50 times the average current of the St. Clair River, which is a large river and very swift. So if one of these oil pipelines ruptures, things could get ugly pretty quickly. So I'm going to show you sort of a simulated spill. It's a crude simulation. We don't really know if it's the worst case scenario because there haven't been that many studies done on the currents in the straits. NOAA's Great Lakes Research Lab is doing a study right now to try to get a handle on, what could happen if one of these pipelines ruptured. So I just took a look at the volume of oil moving through these pipelines, used the 2 mile per hour current figure for the straits, and off we went. So 3 hours after a spill, the plume could reach Mackinac Island, one of the most popular areas in all the Great Lakes. That's 6 hours after the spill. And you have to keep in mind that the spill could go one way, the other way, or possibly both ways, depending on the currents. Things are that sort of dynamic in the straits. So this is 12 hours after a spill, and then 24 hours. Enbridge's emergency response plans say that the quickest they can get to the straits to respond to a spill is 3 hours. They have emergency shutoff valves on both sides of the straits, but as we learned in Kalamazoo, when you shut off the pipeline, that doesn't immediately cut off the supply of oil. I mean, there's oil in the pipe, and things backflow. Sometimes people don't operate equipment properly, so there's definitely reason to be concerned. And then if there were to be a spill in the straits, if the oil didn't sink like tar sands oil tends to, if it floated to the surface, the Great Lakes freeze, and it would be a real challenge to clean up that oil. The Coast Guard had a major exercise in the Straits this past January where they brought in all kinds of spill response folks, researchers, and they threw oranges and peat moss out into the Straits and then tried to sort of clean them up as sort of simulate a spill. And what they discovered, which, doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure this out, that cleaning up oil and ice is very difficult. And that was really about all they learned. They also learned that you have to check your equipment before you go out because it might be frozen. And some of their equipment was frozen. And people get cold when they're working out in the ice. Real simple things like that. So, if there's any good news, it's that this pipeline, as far as we know, hasn't had any major spills in the Straits, but we really don't know much about the condition of the pipeline because Enbridge doesn't release its information to the public, and they're not required to. So with that, I'm going to stop and hand it off to Sara, who will talk about some of the regulatory gaps. And I guess I'll let you introduce Sara.
Hello, everyone. So I did a report on oil pipelines called After the Marshall Spill. Last year, it was part of a grant from the National Sea Grant Law Center, and I teach at the University of Michigan Law School. I'm a lecturer there, and was also a contractor for the National Wildlife Federation, and I worked with students on this project. We looked at the laws governing these oil pipelines, both at the federal level and at the state level. So that's primarily what I'm going to talk about today. There's the front cover of the report. If you're interested, it's on the National Wildlife Federation's website, their Great Lakes office, or there are a couple copies here. But before I get into the law, I just wanted to sort of, talk a little bit about the Great Lakes region as a whole and support some of the conclusions that Beth had, as well as Jeff. One of the things that happened to me when I started looking at this was just my surprise about what the mileage was in our region and the number of incidents. So there you go. That's the most recent figures, as of June 29th, so maybe a little old, but 28,834 miles, 278 incidents in the last 5 years, most of which you're not hearing about, and 3.87 million gallons of liquid spilled in the last 5 years. Okay, wait, before I do that, so which state do you think has the most mileage on oil pipelines? Anybody want to hazard a guess? Texas. Oh, sorry. Well, Texas would be a good answer, but we're going to only talk about the Great Lakes region. Illinois. All right. It's Illinois. Which you maybe could have guessed from that little map, but all right. 7,423 miles. Least is New York. And then we've got it all in between, Minnesota being the next highest after Illinois. So you can see on this chart the total incidents 2007 to 2011, which was the best data that I could get here. And that will show you that there are a number of these incidents happening. And then you can see the total gallons spilled. So obviously Michigan has a very high number, right, because of the Marshall incident. But what's interesting is that the numbers in other states, say in Illinois, right, aren't that far off. And then you have figures for total property damage broken down by state. Now here, these are for significant incidents only. This is the data that I was able to find on the federal website. And again, these numbers are really driven by the Marshall incident because it was so expensive to clean up. All right. So then, just to give you a sense, so the federal structure for pipeline safety does regulate what's called hazardous liquid pipelines. These are oil pipelines, but also regulates natural gas pipelines. So just to give you a sense of sort of what's happening in our region, I took data from the PHMSA, the Pipeline Safety Agency's website, and sort of looked at what the incidents were since 2002. And you'll see that it varies, right? We've got gas transmission lines down at the bottom, least incidents, hazardous liquid. Above that, we have a spike on gas distribution. But mostly, right, we're seeing gas transmission being a little bit lower, hazardous liquid being sort of in the middle, and then gas distribution sort of coming up and down. Just to give you a sense of what's happening nationwide, hazardous liquid incidents, significant incidents, are greater than the other kinds. So here, gas distribution and gas transmission, although they have dropped if you look at the since 1992, and certainly the industry will tell you that they are in a much better place now than they were back in the 90s, and that's true based on incident data. You'll also see that there's a slight uptick sort of here in the last couple years. All right, one of the things that I think is interesting to think about is, per mile of pipeline, what's our incident data? So this is really rough, let me just say. And you can probably quibble with me about how I did this, but I took the average, I took the significant incidents from 2002 to 2011, and I divided them by the most recent mileage, and we get this. And so what we see is that the average significant incidents per mile are very low. There's a lot of pipeline mileage out there. But as between hazardous liquid and these other types of pipelines, we're seeing more incidents per mile for hazardous liquid. And finally, on cause, you can go into the data and you can take a look at what the causes are of these incidents and specific to the Great Lakes region. So what you'll see, which is consistent with what happened in Marshall, is that, well, somewhat consistent, is that it's material weld, equipment failure, corrosion, these issues around pipelines themselves, right, that are really driving these incidents. So things like excavation damage, which is an issue that people talk a lot about with pipelines, third-party damage from excavation certainly is a problem, but not nearly as much a problem as the pipelines themselves, that is the infrastructure, the aging infrastructure. All right, so this, just again, to give you a summary of the data side, right? So we've had about an average of 21 incidents annually, and that stayed roughly the same. It's been very small per mile of pipe, but hazardous liquid pipelines are substantially higher than gas pipelines for incidents per mile. And we're caused most often by failures in the pipeline materials themselves. Okay, so then this drives the analysis of the law, right? What's happening about these incidents and what is going on in terms of the regulation of the pipeline materials. Okay, so to understand this, I think you have to break it into 3 different sections, which is what we did in our report. The first is to look at routing and siting of new pipelines, because where those pipelines go then matters for what is going to be the environmental harm, right, when a pipeline breaks. Then the question of operation and maintenance of existing pipelines. Pipelines are in the ground. What are the regulations governing those pipelines that make sure, for example, that they're being assessed, that these defects are being repaired? And then finally, what is the planning for the worst case scenario? And what happens if a spill occurs? Where's the reporting? So this attempts to take a look at all of those issues in a fairly complex slide here. But what I'm interested in here is just a breakdown in federal and state authority to give you a sense of where this all goes, right? On the routing side, the federal agency charged with regulating pipelines, PHMSA, is actually prohibited from regulating routing of oil pipelines. What this means nationally is that the federal government is not looking at where these pipelines are going. There's no permitting process, no review process for that outside of, for example, if you have to get a wetlands permit, right? So states are having to make decisions about whether they choose to regulate, and not all of them do. So pipelines are routed and sited in areas sometimes without any review about what's going to happen if a spill occurs in that particular site. All right, on operation and maintenance of existing pipelines, there is a whole regulatory scheme in place. For interstate pipelines, these are pipelines that cross state borders, Line 6B from the Marshall incident being an example of that. The federal government has exclusive authority to regulate those pipelines, has a set of regulations in place. Those regulations depend on whether there are particular areas of concern around those pipelines. These are called high consequence areas. If those pipelines could affect those high consequence areas, they're subject to something called the Integrity Management Program. And that does a bunch of things. One is it requires pipeline companies to actually continually assess their pipelines. It also requires them to repair those pipelines in a specific set of situations. So that integrity management program is certainly better than what applies to pipelines that are not within these high consequence areas. We don't know the extent of high consequence areas across the United States because that information is kept secret because of concerns about terrorism. So we don't have a sense of, where, for example, in the Great Lakes region, there are particular high consequence areas or not, where there are particularly environmentally sensitive areas, and if those actually match up with what we might think are environmentally sensitive areas. All right, states are fairly limited in what they can do with interstate pipelines. They can conduct oversight and inspections, but this is not nothing, right? State agencies can actually see what's happening with these big interstate pipelines in their states, and having that knowledge and having that inspection authority can actually be very helpful. Intrastate pipelines, states can actually take authority over these pipelines. Not that many have in the Great Lakes region, but you can. And then finally, on emergency response planning and spill reporting. There are actually two sets of emergency response planning requirements in law. One is under PHMSA's regulations, that's the Federal Pipeline Safety Agency, and they have the exclusive authority to set those requirements. And then under the Oil Pollution Act, there are facility response plans required of pipeline operators. So these are response plans for what happens in the worst case scenario for an oil spill. There are minimum standards in law for those. PHMSA reviews them. Under the recent NTSB report that Beth mentioned from the Marshall spill, one of the things that the NTSB called out was the lack of careful review of these facility response plans because there were not enough staff in PHMSA to do this, and because the requirements weren't specific enough about what pipeline operators actually had to do in thinking about putting equipment and everything on the ground. States could, if they chose, have companies actually submit to them response plans, facility response plans, that would be state facility response plans, and would be able to see what pipeline operators are doing in terms of emergency response planning. No states in the Great Lakes region have done this, but they do have the authority to do it, and there's some interesting models out on the West Coast, Washington in particular. All right, and then spill reporting, there is a set of spill reporting requirements in federal law. Within 30 days, there has to be spill reporting for spills greater than 5 gallons, and then there's, for significant incidents, you were seeing some data on significant incidents, they have to be reported immediately. All right, and then states can certainly require spill reporting. One of the interesting facts coming off of the Marshall spill is that Michigan didn't have a reporting requirement in place for pipeline oil spills. So they were getting reported to the federal government, but they weren't getting reported to the state. All right, so this just summarizes the weaknesses as I see them. I think one of the main weaknesses in thinking about the Great Lakes as a basin is that there's no consideration of cumulative impacts of these kinds of oil spills. On the routing side, there's no review of long-term risks of spills to environmentally sensitive areas because the federal government is prohibited, actually, or the PHMSA is prohibited from actually thinking about that. There's no consideration of environmentally sensitive areas, all environmentally sensitive areas in managing these risks, only those that are of high consequence. As I explained, we don't know which areas are high consequence in the Great Lakes region because we don't have maps to tell us that because of concerns, security concerns. And there are no specific requirements for facility response plans, and inadequate review by staff coming off of this NTSB report. Okay, so here's where we are on the state regulation side. We've got a couple of states that do in fact look at routing and siting of pipelines. So if you're in Illinois, Michigan, or Minnesota, you have some review of where pipelines go. If you're not, you don't. Interstate oversight, Minnesota and New York. For intrastate regulation, that is pipelines that occur solely within state borders, you have Indiana, Minnesota, and New York. Nobody requires response plans to be submitted to the state. And there are a number of states that do require spill reporting, all at fairly different thresholds. All right, so finally the recommendations. We actually thought that somebody should get together and facilitate discussions among the states and provinces to think about this from a Great Lakes region-wide perspective and a basin-wide perspective, and we recommended the Great Lakes Commission as well as, I should say, the International Joint Commission, which is not on here. We also thought the state should pick up and do some more on regulating pipelines, that there really was an opportunity there. By the way, there is funding provided by PHMSA for up to 80% of state programs. And so the hit to states is not as great as you might think. All right, and then states should be setting stringent standards for pipeline operators to submit response plans. We're back to the question of what happens with emergency response planning. States should be setting these requirements, and they should be requiring plans to be submitted to the state so they can actually take a look at what's going on with these pipeline operators. And then, of course, all states should require reporting. States should know what's happening in terms of spills within their own states. So there you go. There are some resources if you're interested. We've got the Office of Pipeline Safety Trust, and I have to thank Carl Weimer in particular for some of this data at the beginning of my presentation. And then, of course, the National Wildlife Federation and Beth. Thanks very much.
I know you know which one it is.
Hey, good morning, everybody. I'm Brian Huberty with Fish and Wildlife, and I get to deal with emergency responses once in a while. The good news is no PowerPoint.
Hey.
Actually, those are great PowerPoints. What I have is, where'd they disappear to? Right there. Okay. I have a selection of just short videos, and these were created off of Google Earth for our folks internally because after the Kalamazoo or Michigan oil spill, our folks realized, hey, we might need to get a handle on where these oil pipelines and other infrastructure are to respond to them. We have a variety of oil pipelines, tank farms, refineries around the region, and it's probably more than we expect. And I just have a few of these that I just pulled out for this, just to show you roughly what the gas and oil pipeline looks like, structure for the Detroit area, and it's quite a network as we fly up the river. And there's a couple others, and the point of this is to think about what could happen, and if something happens, and how should they, as we brought up with the Straits of Mackinac, it's an aging piece of pipeline. Maybe it should be replaced fairly soon. Some of these are natural gas, some of those are oils pipelines going over to Sarnia. I'm not going to belabor all these videos because we really don't have time. We should really get to questions. So let's get a couple more in here. Sheboygan, this one caught my eye. I didn't realize there was actually an oil ship tank facility up at the northern end of Michigan. I don't know who runs this, but you can obviously see the ship there, and it's just off the Straits of Mackinac. And I think there's a feeder line that comes over from one of those pipelines that come across the strait there, which is on up to the upper left there. All right, a couple more. And hopefully we won't get you too sick here. Chicago, you've seen Enbridge, Gulf oil spill we've seen before. Well, here's the Mackinac. Sarnia? That's, what do you got against the Canadians? There you go. That's just the oil refineries, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure this stuff out. You don't need a green dot or anything. And this is looking, heading west towards the river, a very large complex. And Chicago has this as well. But again, you have to ask your question is what happens if, there's a, God forbid, a oil refinery fire or a pipeline breaks. Eventually it will get into the system.
The two main lines in the Enbridge system feeding the refineries in Sarnia are line 5 and line 6B, both of which are being expanded, as Jeff has mentioned. Line 6B is being replaced, 36-inch pipeline, which will be annual carrying capacity of 800,000 barrels per day. And then line 5 is being upgraded, which just means increased horsepower, pumping stations, 15,000 barrels per day increase. And they aren't doing any retrofitting to that line that I know of.
For you Packer fans? Actually, there's a little bit of a facility near Green Bay as well. It is interesting when you look at this information is a lot of it is generated, a lot of these facilities are near rivers, Great Lakes systems, and it has to do with transportation. And you'll see it right there on the left on the outlet of the Fox River. There's a bunch of tank farms and refineries. I think there's one refinery over there somewhere. And there's the Green Bay. Toledo. Like one of our refuges, Sweeney National Wildlife Refuge is in the UP. Come on, bring it up. No, it's not bringing it up. Come here. No, it doesn't want to do it. Mackinac City, you've seen that. And these are rough approximations. This data set was a number of years old, so it's not exact. And you can sort of see that in the Google Earth imagery. You can actually see the pathways there. Maybe do one more and we'll get into questions because that's probably what's more important. Sweeney didn't want to come up. Traverse City isn't that interesting. Oh, let's do Chicago. That's a good one. Come on. There's Chicago, south end of downtown Chicago. BP has a huge facility there. I don't know the other ones offhand. Another thing to think about is not just, we talk about pipelines. We're seeing it in Minnesota is we have now 100+ car rail trains coming from the North Dakota oil fields. And there was an oil spill up by Duluth. I think a tank car went off the bridge, railroad bridge back in the 80s or 90s, so there was a spill that actually went in the harbor. It'd be an interesting study from a standpoint of safety and so forth of how do they compare. I'm sure the costs are much higher with the railroads, but there isn't enough infrastructure to put this stuff in. And that's just zooming out, just showing you all the different tank farms and refineries in the Midwest. So we have a large infrastructure. I'm just going to leave it at that and pass it on to Beth for questions.
So as I've mentioned quickly, there are major expansion plans happening within the Great Lakes Basin. The entire Lakehead system is one of those. And if you're familiar with the Keystone XL debate, the reason for these expansions is because the tar sands Alberta region is expanding and they want to get this oil in that area to other markets. And we have the infrastructure already. There's been holdups with the Northern Gateway project and the Canadian Rockies with Keystone XL. There's holdup there. And so they're looking more creatively to current infrastructure and pumping more product through that current infrastructure. And guess what? We have it. And so the Great Lakes Basin is quickly becoming the anchor for this product. We we are not only transporting it, we're refining it, because they're more often than not shipping it in its raw form, which is called diluted bitumen. That's a product that's spilled in the Kalamazoo River. It's basically the raw bitumen, which is like holding a chunk of clay. They dilute it with this gas condensate, increase pressures on pipelines to pump it to the refineries, and with this increased pressure, they have increased heats, and there's questions, especially in Congress and before the National Academy of Sciences, as to whether this product and transporting it in its raw form is more corrosive and more hazardous to our current pipeline infrastructure. And so I want to quickly put up some recommendations for the Great Lakes. As Sara's mentioned most of these, the Great Lakes Basin should, in its entirety, the National Wildlife Federation feels, be considered a high consequence area, unusually sensitive area, and all the regulations that come with those classifications should be applied to the Great Lakes Basin, and all pipelines should be regulated under integrity management programs. Obviously, we should encourage renewable energy and try to shift some of our dependency on oil, coal, gas. I'll quickly go through all of these. And I will mention again that we're releasing a report, and Sara's report on rules and regulations is up here if you want a copy, but next week we're releasing a report on Line 5, and all of these recommendations will be in that report as well. Additional response plans, more interaction with local communities and the areas where the pipelines lie. Jeff had mentioned that the best case scenario, 3 hours from Escanaba, is how long it would take Enbridge to respond to a spill at the Straits, 5 hours from Bay City. And so we're asking that they increase their response centers and their activity in that area so that we can ensure. But I will highlight a couple points that Jeff mentioned with that pipeline, and Brian said, perhaps we should replace it. Is that it's at the bottom of the lake, so if a spill occurs, and if they are transporting an upgraded or raw form of diluted bitumen, it's heavier than water, and so it will stay at the bottom of the lake. It will not surface, or very little of it will surface. And there's no regulations telling PHMSA, the federal agency, when product changes in a pipeline. Currently, Enbridge says it's all light crudes, upgraded crudes that, should have the consistency that's lighter than water and surface and float up. But there's no regulations in place that require Enbridge to notify PHMSA when product changes. And so at any point, they could be transporting diluted bitumen or the raw tar sands through that pipeline, and there's no notification that has to occur. So that's a huge issue and a huge concern, and something that we think the federal agencies should consider. So I'll leave these up so people can digest them, and I do want to open it up for Q&A. And there are some success stories in working with pipeline operators to increase pipeline safety, and Anglers of the Asabo, as Jeff mentioned, is one of them. And so we encourage you to come up to us later, and we can provide further information and recommendations. Sorry, since we're being recorded, we want to.
I'm curious. Obviously, there's a lot to be done within the state side of the pipeline industry and transportation. But what about international? Because there are a number of international crossings of these pipelines, and just the response. I mean, who would be responsible? Is a protocol for that, and then other reporting requirements, et cetera?
So the Department of State, so when Keystone XL went through, you probably heard about the Department of State reviewing that, and there was a environmental impact assessment process along with that. So the Department of State does review boundary sort of activities at boundary crossings, including pipeline construction activities at boundary crossings. Now, I think there's some question whether maintenance activities, particularly sort of what they might consider minor maintenance activities, would get any sort of review at all, or whether it would be under the existing approval. But that's how the sort of construction, possibly maintenance, would be reviewed. And then on the emergency response side, This is an area I know less well, to be honest, but I think there is coordination between the Canadian emergency response folks and the U.S. emergency response folks. I know that's something that the IJC has talked about, and maybe there's somebody else who can talk a little bit more about it.
There's probably some experts in the room, and so if any folks know any of the answers to the questions that are coming up, feel free to chime in.
Enbridge is putting in a new pipeline that is going across northwest Indiana from Sarnia. I think they're putting in a new pipeline also in Michigan after the spill. And I don't know if there's any expert in this room, but one person who, I can't mention his name, but he is very knowledgeable in this area. Their plan is to leave the old pipeline in the ground. And I think they said they're going to try to clean it out, and they're supposed to be putting nitrogen or something in it. This individual, who is very knowledgeable, stated that that is a very bad plan, and that there is not a way of being assured that there will not be some residual oil that will, in fact, through the years, since it won't be a maintained pipeline, leak out into the environment. And I was wondering if anyone here has looked into that and could give us some input.
Yes, the line 6B is the line that ruptured in Michigan, is being replaced in its entirety. And it's fallen to state level, even though it's an international pipeline, because of certain parameters that have happened, and I can explain those to folks that are interested. But they're filling the old pipeline. Replacement is a bad word, because the old line is staying in the ground, and they're building a much larger pipeline next to it, in most cases in the existing right-of-way. The line 6B, the old line, is going to be filled with inert gas, and they're decommissioning it based on state standards, which does not require them to remove the pipeline. There's also a question as to whether parts of it can be reopened at a certain time and put back into use. You know, there's debates going on whether that could happen or not, but it is floating out there as a possibility. But the new line 6B is, as I mentioned, 36-inch pipeline, much larger. Regarding the inspection, they do have to monitor it at a minimal level. I don't know the specifics around that, and that's something that if you want to come get my information, I can help you. And I do know folks with the Pipeline Safety Trust, as does Sara, and so we can point you to some resources on finding out more information around that. But they do have to monitor it at some level. You know, current pipelines are not monitored that great, so I can't imagine that decommissioned pipelines will be as well.
Hi, I'm Nicole Barker, the Executive Director at Save the Dunes in Indiana, and Jeanette's our board member as well as board president. And what was really interesting was I got a call from Beth a few months ago saying, hey, Nicole, did you know that Enbridge is hosting a meeting about their pipeline expansion in Indiana tomorrow night in LaPorte, which is actually where I live, and I live about 2 miles away from the pipeline. I wasn't notified. We are the lead environmental advocacy group in the state of Indiana, in Northwest Indiana, that is. And we were really concerned. We're also concerned because the timeline that they stated to us was, you know what, this is all happening by year's end. And so it's been a real eye-opener for us to see the lack of regulation, the lack of oversight. There's no single entity assessing the risk to our region. And when I looked at, in particular, the statistics about the Marshall spill moving around 30 to 40 miles away from the original rupture, and we did the analysis in our state where we have more than 30 crossings of major waterways that go into Lake Michigan, and all of our waterways are within 20 miles of the lake. So basically, if Marshall happened in Indiana, it would all be in Lake Michigan.